Did you know there's a major difference in football or soccer stadium rules in the USA versus England? Or that the gender divide in the sport is actually swapped between the countries? While I am not the world's foremost expert on football or soccer, whatever you want to call it, I did play at least 2 seasons on a team between the ages of about 7 to 9, mostly because my best friend was actually talented in the sport and the only way that I could hang out with her more was pretending like I liked it too. I've also done a ton of research into the differences between football and or soccer culture in England and the USA, so for both of those reasons I feel fully qualified to be deep diving into football in England and soccer in the USA and how actually the sport is experienced differently in many ways in both countries, even though the rules are the same. I will also have you know that I did score a goal during my soccer career, and yeah, it was on accident and for the other team, but does it really matter? I don't know. Also, they spelled my name wrong on my trophy, so that still haunts me. Also, unrelated but related, I was going to film this outside to be more authentic on our subject topic, but it's hay fever season and I don't feel like suffocating and scratching my eyes out for the sake of this YouTube video, so please imagine me going the extra mile and filming this outdoors. Anyway, I've lived in England for over 10 years, and in that 10 years, I've really come to experience how true it is that football is a hugely important sport here. It's one of the big or the biggest powerhouse sport that tons of people follow, and I thought it would be interesting to share how it differs across the pond, and not just in the first major difference, but in many others. So difference number 1, we'll get this out of the way quickly. The sport with 11 players on a side trying to kick a ball like this into the goal on the opposite team's side is called football in England and it's called soccer in America, but the term soccer actually originated from England. Football actually used to be called soccer in England and used more interchangeably. The sport's full name when it was first made official in 1863 was Association Football to differentiate it from other types of football in England at the time, like rugby football. Now it's just called rugby, and football is just called football, but the association football name eventually got shortened to ASOC football, which somehow then got shortened into soccer. And so this was used in England for a long time, and it made its way across the pond and the Americans adopted it. As many of you know, in the US, what we call football looks like this. There are other language differences as well. 2 notable ones. So first one, in England, these things are called football boots. In the US, these are called cleats or soccer cleats. Another very commonly used language difference is that in England, this is called the pitch or the football pitch, whereas in the US, it's called the field or the soccer field. Now, before we get into the differences in the professional playing of the sport between countries, let's talk about the recreational side of the sport because I find this incredibly fascinating. In England, as you would expect, plenty of kids play football growing up, a solid 30% of them according to statistics. This makes sense, given that it's the most popular sport in the UK. There would arguably be massive amount of kids involved from a young age who want to be like their favorite players and are continually exposed to the sport in culture. In America, however, you might think there would be lower participation, given that the US's professional soccer culture is not very prominent. Surely, all of the kids are playing American football or baseball or other sports, and they are playing those sports, but they're also playing soccer in very large numbers. In fact, my experience is backed up by questions you can find on the internet, like, why is soccer so popular with US kids but so unpopular with US adults? It's one of the cheapest, easiest, and most popular sports to get involved with as a kid, despite the fact that we don't necessarily grow up with the major exposure to the sport in a non-recreational way. I was not a particularly athletic kid, and even I was thrown on a team to get some running around in on the weekends, and while I think I looked forward more to the snacks than the actual gameplay, I don't think I was alone in that. I found a very accurate quote on Reddit, which said, "When I was enrolled to soccer as a kid, maybe 2 or 3 kids on the team actually liked soccer. Most American kids don't play soccer because they want to play soccer. They play soccer because their parents think they're too young or too delicate to play another sport. Youth sports are incredibly popular in the USA, and soccer is one of them. You don't need a ton of equipment, it's a low-risk sport in case your kid quits in the next season, and as they get older, many American kids will then switch into other sports that bring more glory and fame in the professional sense. These include, as I said, American football, baseball, basketball, and ice hockey. But being on a soccer team as a kid has been a widespread core memory for a lot of Americans my age and still continues to this day. However, just because American kids are playing soccer too, it doesn't mean we're doing it well. Alex from We Make Footballers, who experienced youth football coaching in both England and the USA, writes that the drills in England are much more technical than the ones given in the USA, and that the skills of the youngest players in England are far superior to the skills of the youngest players that he experienced in the USA. He noted that children often start earlier in England and mentions the seasonal aspect of youth sports in America also playing a role. So many American children will play a different sport per season, something like soccer in the autumn, baseball in the spring, basketball in the winter, etc. So you're essentially ditching the sport that's not in season for the whole rest of the year while playing other sports. He noticed that while coaching youth football in England, the training was more year-round, which meant that the child wasn't losing skills from season to season. Then we have the sort of in-between years, where you're no longer playing youth sports, but certainly not playing professionally. This is a fascinating divide as well, as this time in a person's life, which continues throughout adulthood, as long as you're playing recreationally, which most people are, is different in both countries. In England, there are plenty, and I mean plenty, of opportunities for adults to play football. I call it village football, but basically it's moving on from youth sports into a recreational league, but a league that still has rules, still has standings, still has tournaments. So again, it is recreational. We're not at the World Cup here, but you can still play the game with other adults, typically male in England, which we'll get to in a minute. But it is ingrained in the culture here. It's not uncommon for teams to be oversubscribed with too many players and not enough playing times in certain areas. In the US, adult soccer leagues for recreational players do exist. I'm not saying they don't. I'm not saying they're nowhere to be found, because they definitely are. But even the more talented American older teenagers who play on their high school soccer teams and then go on to collegiate soccer, they're usually going to quit the sport after graduation. This is a difference in the university and high school systems in the two countries as well. High school and college sports are incredibly popular in the USA, with not really an equivalent in the UK unless you're talking about something like rowing. So non-professional players in America will often see the college route as their way of achieving their soccer dreams and getting to compete against colleges around the country and kind of like reaching the peak of their participation in the sport. Whereas recreational English players seem to think of the sport as like a lifelong journey, whether it's playing pickup games or continuing on into the village football style of play. On that note, and to bring us into the professional levels, let's talk about gender in football/soccer, because this is another interesting difference in the way the sport is perceived in both countries. In England, while there have been recent victories in women's professional football that have encouraged more girls to get into the sport, there exists a gender divide that heavily skews male when it comes to playing the sport. When we're talking about recreational playing, only about 1 in 7, or about 15% of youth football players in England are girls, making the male component a solid 85%. In the US, this split is much closer to equal, with some statistics saying 60% male and 40% female, and some pretty close to 50% and 50%. In fact, overall, soccer in the US is incredibly popular among women. There are a couple of specific reasons for this. Firstly, the US was an early adopter of women's soccer, and that means creating more development camps and opportunity for trainings and future goals to aspire to for female soccer players in the US. There was also an educational bill called Title IX in 1972, and this made gender equality mandatory in education in the US. This also extended, as I've mentioned, to sports, because sports and high school and college in the US very much combined. So what this did was it led to more women's sports teams and scholarships available. And the final outcome, in addition to the talent developed within the US on the women's side, is notoriety at the professional levels. The US women's national team is more notable in the US based on surveys than the men's national soccer team. And while the England women's football team has definitely made major strides and had some great victories and is supported by many fans, the men's national football team in England is still far more known in England than the women's overall. So now that we're talking professional football/soccer, let's keep that ball rolling. In England, I'm going to say this wrong because this is based on my other video I did on how to pronounce things in the UK. Okay, in England, I would call it the Premier League, but I know it's called the Premier. In England, the Premier League, did I say that right? Is arguably one of the world's most prominent football entities. It was established in 1992 after the reform of what was called the Football League First Division. They use a promotion and relegation system so that teams throughout the league can be relegated or promoted based on outcomes. And so that's a pretty exciting factor of the sport in England for many fans. Some teams are very solidly in one area of the league and some are kind of in between, so the fact that you could be moved up or bumped down is a pretty exciting aspect of the sport. The closest American equivalent, which is the MLS or Major League Soccer, is the foremost professional league in the USA, and they do not use a promotion or relegation aspect. There are ordered tiers in the US, but a club would only move between levels based on financial merit and not performance. The history of this organization is also far younger. While the Premier League technically was established in 1992, it came from a long history of organized football within England. The MLS was established in 1993, but this was as kind of the first established professional soccer structure within the US. For instance, all while growing up in Orlando, we did not have a professional soccer team to support. The soccer team that exists now, Orlando City, was established in 2013, so it's only about 10 years old. Soccer as a professional sport with followers and fans is much newer in the US than in the UK, and the league in the US lacks the history and prestige of the Premier League. And finally, the matchday experience in England versus the USA is again pretty different in some interesting ways. First, let's call it like it is. English fans of any club are far more dedicated and passionate than most American fans. The number of supporters in the away team at a match of an English club is sizable. While in the US, stadiums are very far apart, and it would include like a plane ride to get to a stadium that your home team is playing at, if not your own. So there's usually only a few supporters from the away team at any match. The American style experience at a soccer game is seen as more family friendly. It's like a fun day out that you bought last minute tickets to because your friends are in town and you're looking for something to do. In England, it's a far more intense and passionate experience, and even getting tickets to a match can be incredibly difficult as tickets mostly go to longtime club supporters, season ticket holders, etc. It's not as easy as just deciding that you want to go last minute unless you have a significant amount of money to pay. Because of this passionate atmosphere, there is also a ban on alcohol being consumed in view of the pitch at football matches in England. This has been in place since 1985 and was started to try and curb something called hooliganism, which we'll talk about in a minute. There is no similar ban in the USA. Again, they just want to get you in seats. Now, it would be impossible to do a video about English football without mentioning the history of its fans, as there have been some tragic incidents related to violence and what is known as hooliganism within England. This was at its peak in the 1970s and 1980s, and unfortunately, football fans in England around this time did gain a reputation for violent behavior, racist behavior, and crowd violence. There have been incidents as well in recent years by some of the bad apples of football fans. However, not all football fans, of course, even in the 70s and 80s, can be painted with this brush. The majority were just passionate people who wanted to watch football, but with some cracking down on football-related violence in the late 80s and well into the 90s, English football fans have earned a much better reputation these days, and incidents are now more scattered and don't typically take place at the matches themselves. Going to a football match in England these days is typically much more of a family-friendly experience. They include family zones and can be a nice day out, if not a bit intense when it comes to the noise, depending on what teams are playing. American soccer does have incidents of scattered violence between soccer fans as well, but due to the short history of the sport in a professional sense, the fact that there are fewer away supporters at games, and the fact that most Americans just don't care as much about the sport to the levels they do in England, means that this isn't a sport in the US that has ever been associated with poor crowd behavior overall. Don't worry, we have our own of those, it's just not soccer. The passion that England football fans show also comes out in other ways, including very popular football chants. A lot of these are very famous. They include lots of in-jokes depending on what team you're supporting. They can get relatively raunchy and purposefully offensive, which is a real shock to the people that you've seen doing the reacting to England football chants videos, but mostly they're humorous and an important component of the atmosphere of a match. In the US, the chants are far less inspired, often called cringy by the Brits, and far less creative. There is really no competition between the two. In conclusion, if you want a real, authentic football experience with top-notch training and involved fans, come to England. You'll miss getting to watch little American me kick the ball into the wrong goal and then cry to my dad about it, but you'll get to experience football in the place that it all started and see the legacy and history of this sport as it was meant to be played. Thanks very much for watching. Hope you learned something new today as always, and I'll see you next time.